It's time, as they say. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the March 2025 meeting of the Historical Society. Again, I know most of you all. Those of you who I do not know, I'm Bob Holliday. I'm the president. This is the estimable Will Gandy, who is our vice president and treasurer, who helps keep me who helps keep me straight. I know, you have no idea. Several quick announcements, and I'll ask a couple of people to come up. If you have not been around the last week, we unveiled 2 historical markers. One last week out at the Velda Mound in Arbor Hill, and then one yesterday down at for the Bel Air community down at McNeil Road and Woodville Highway. And the markers both look great. We'll have pictures of them in our next newsletter, but do go by and see them. And they did a really good job on those markers. The next event, because we're in festival season and so forth, the next big event is the March 22nd History Festival and Expo that we sort of co-sponsor with Tallahassee State College up in Kleeman Plaza. It's Saturday from 10 until 2 p.m. Booths and all sorts of stuff and food, so everybody should come out. What else? I'd like to introduce Kimberly Elliott. Is she here? Kimberly from she's senior curator at the Florida Museum of History, and she is here to put the arm on you all. Come on up, Kimberly.
Okay, that's true, but that's not the way I would have said it. Good evening, everybody. I'm Kimberly Elliott, if you haven't met me before. As Bob said, I'm a senior curator at the Museum of Florida History, and I'm here to talk to you quickly about Florida History Day. Has anybody show of hands? Anybody volunteered to judge before? Awesome! I'd love to see it.
We provide a lot of judges for that.
And we love it. So if you don't know about Florida History Day, it's over 50 years old. It was founded in 1974, and it is an opportunity for students from 6th through 12th grade to put together historical projects, do primary research. They can make exhibits, websites, performances, historical papers, or documentaries. And we solicit judges from the community because the Museum of Florida History runs the statewide competition. So students from all over the state will congregate here on May 4th, 5th, and 6th to see who will be representing the state moving forward at the national competition in the summer in Maryland. And so what we need are a nice esteemed group of judges that can help us evaluate the students. We just ask that you have a bachelor's degree and an affinity for history. But I think the most important thing that a judge can have is a really positive and supportive attitude. These students are really putting themselves out there. They've done this research either with their teacher or throughout the year in class, and they just have a varying level of skill. Some students you see will create outstanding work, and it's super interesting to see. Others need a little bit more guidance, and that's where us as judges come through to support them. We all here have a nice understanding for the importance of history, and so being able to kind of push it forward and support students who are already involved in history and interested in history, and kind of keep them on the path to being good citizens and stewards and whatnot. So if you're interested, you can email me. I'll leave a couple of my cards with Bob, and then I also sent you an email that hopefully you'll share with the membership that has the link to sign up. And if you have any questions, you can call the museum and ask for me, Kimberlyn, and I'd be happy to answer them. Any questions right now? No. Yes?
So what would be the date you're looking for people?
So it would be Monday, March 5th, thank you for asking, because it's from 8 o'clock in the morning till about 12:30 in the afternoon. Lunch is complimentary, we give you beverages in the morning. Sorry, May 5th. No. Sorry, I'm speaking to you from the past. No, yes, Monday, May 5th, from 8 in the morning, so judges check in around 7:30, 7:45. And then the first round is done around 12:30, and then if you love us a lot and you want to do runoffs, you'll be there till about 5. Yes, Marty?
And where is it held?
Oh my gosh, you guys ask such good questions. It is held at Tallahassee State College. You guys are great. Any other fundamental things?
In the
that you
student,
like?
in the student
Yes.
union and around campus.
How do children sign up? So at this point, they should have already competed in their counties, so they'll have to sign up for the next calendar year. And so if it isn't at your child's school and you'd like it to be, that's definitely something you can reach out to the museum and we can see if there's a children's coordinator in your county to get you connected with. All right, May 5th, 8 o'clock in the morning, Tallahassee State College. I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Frank, you got anything to say about the docent situation down at the First Florida Capitol?
Thank you, Bob. For everyone who's here, the cabin, the First Florida Capitol replica that we built for the bicentennial, we operate on the weekends, opening it up to the public. So we are always looking for docents. What a docent is really just, as we all know, being in history, being greeters, and we all have our own little explanations we like to give around the building, but we certainly love to have more volunteers. But also a week, next Wednesday, which I guess is in 6 days, at the cabin site at 5:30, we're at the mayor. We're having a social and a little meeting of the First Florida Capitol and a social. We'll have some food, we'll have a little band, and we're gonna talk about the cabin and just have fun. So everyone here is welcome to come. Again, next Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. at the cabin in Cascades Park for a meeting and social. So thank you. And we have our website, firstfloridacapital.org, and people can sign up for docents there. We're not taking RSVPs for the meeting, but to sign up for a docent, there's a sign up page on the website. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Before we go any further, let's give a big round of applause for Neil Mooney and Valerie Chung for providing this chili tonight. There he is. There's Neil.
Thank you, Neil.
He cooked it himself. One last announcement before we start. Marty, our own Marty Patel handed me this just a minute ago, and so I'll just read it. Dear friend, will you join me in helping my daughter-in-law in her quest to reach 1,000 people as part of her research study? It is for her doctorate in clinical psychology as she focuses on the impact of COVID and its lingering effects on mental health. You can finish the survey in 5 to 10 minutes. You do not have to list your name. So you'll be getting an email about this. Everybody here, you'll be getting an email about this with a link to it to take this survey. And I think it's actually a very good thing. How did COVID affect all of us? I mean, I know that we had to cut our season short in 2020. We just stopped meeting. So anyway, there's that. Finally, how many people have a cat? How many people have more than one cat? So be honest, who is the boss in your house? I mean, when you come home from work, is he or she waiting at the door with that look on their face saying, where the hell have you been? By the way, where's my food? Yes, me too. I mean, exactly. The Egyptians used to worship cats. We all still worship cats. And they apparently certainly did down on Marco Key. I read Austin's book when it came out, 3 years ago now. It was up for one of the Florida Book Awards, and it's a really fascinating story. And Austin Bell from the Florida Museum of History, are they ever going to open it again, by the way? Is here, will speak to us about it, and also has a little game he'd like to get everybody to participate in. So, Austin, it's all yours.
Thanks, guys. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'm really excited to be here. It's Florida Archaeology Month, and I'm excited to talk to you about the Key Marco cat. which is one of the more well-known archaeological artifacts from the state of Florida. And I had the good fortune of working with and researching this particular object over the past 10 plus years in my previous role down in Marco Island. I was the curator there at the local historical museum. That was my first real job out of graduate school. And as Bob mentioned, now I'm at the Museum of Florida History. I've been there coming up on 1 year now, but the great thing is that also falls under our mission, the Key Marco artifacts. We actually have a Key Marco display in our exhibit when we're open, hopefully open again soon. So I myself am not an archaeologist, but I'll get into the story of sort of why I came to write this book about this particular object. It seems a little excessive to write an entire book about one particular object, and that may be true. But really, in sort of researching this object and the site that it came from, we learned quite a bit in putting together the exhibit down on Marco Island about the journey of this object, and sort of not just looking at it at one specific, static period in time, but really the life or lives that it's had across many different time periods, from when it was first made by its likely Calusa Native American creators down in Southwest Florida to its current position on exhibit in the Marco Island Historical Museum. So I'm going to sort of take you through that life journey of this particular object and all the insights that it can offer us about the world that sort of changed around it over many hundreds of years. And so, before we begin, I guess I'm going to get this game started. And I hope it's not too complicated, but there are prizes. The only catch is you must be present at the end of this talk to win. So I'm going to be my hostages here for a little while. Try to keep it as succinct as I can. Okay, but the game is, I have a stash of books at home that are collecting dust. One of them is the book that this talk is based on, and then I've got children's books, and these were, by the way, funded. The research and production of these books were all funded by the Marco Island Historical Society, and I was part of the effort to get that object back on loan to that museum. And so we also created a children's book to help educate younger audiences about the Calusa and the Key Marco artifacts. So anyway, I've got 4 prizes here, and they correspond with 4 trivia questions, and I'm going to ask you them now rather than at the end of the presentation. And they all have numerical answers. So everybody watch The Price is Right before. You know how the rules work. You guess a number, but you can't go over. If you go over, you don't win. So whoever can guess these answers without going over and comes the closest is going to win. So I've got index cards. I'm going to give them to Will. He's going to pass them around. We'll wait a minute. Here we go. Start passing these around, and we've got little golf pencils too. This may take a minute. I apologize for the delay.
Can I hand some out?
Yeah, which is the golf pencils.
Oh,
Everybody just
I
gets
should
a
have
pencil.
pencils out. Oh, good, yes.
So what we're going to do, everybody gets an index card and a pencil. You write your name on the index card and write 1 through 4. I'm going to ask 4 questions. And when I ask each question, put your best guess as to what the answer is. And then we'll pass around this basket, you turn in your answers, and Will and Bob are going to work on figuring out who the winner is. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll have some winners, and we'll give these books away to whoever gets the closest, because the answers are going to be scattered throughout the presentation. So I hope this is fun and not more of a headache for everyone that's here. Yes, it's a pop quiz.
Does everybody have cards?
Cards? Yep. And a pencil or a writing instrument? Okay. Questions? All right. Okay, so make sure your names are on the cards. And the first question.
Wait, we're still.
Oh, you still got some going out. Okay.
Main implements.
What's it for? 8 cans for 2. One for what?
Who needs what?
1 through 4. Yeah, there's going to be 4 questions. All right. I'll go ahead and ask the first question, then we can take a little time to answer that. And you might want to take a look at this picture. That is the key Marco cat on the right there. I'm not going to give you any ideas of the exact scale, but you can probably make some inferences. The first question is, how much does the key Marco cat weigh?
Can we ask what it's made out of?
It is made out of wood.
In ounces or pounds?
You please answer in ounces and to 2 decimal points. You can do a .00. We gotta make sure there's no ties. Yeah, we did, last time I did this, we did ounces or pounds, but then we were finding it difficult to convert pounds to ounces on this.
Cheating if we have one and we're weighing it now.
As long as that's not the original one, I don't think it's. Okay, does everybody have a number written down for number 1? Okay, the next question. So you'll learn a little bit about how much the key Marco cat has traveled as a museum object in this presentation. What is the total mileage that the cat has traveled since it was excavated in 1896 around the country? How many miles? What's that?
Has it been abroad?
It has not been abroad. That's a good hint. All right, everybody have a guess? Okay. The third question, how many years has the key Marco cat been on exhibit? Now, it was excavated in 1896, so that's just about 129 years ago. How many of those 129 years has it been on exhibit? And please answer in years and months. That's as of this month, how many months has it been on exhibit? March 2025. And it was discovered in March 1896. Years and months.
You know,
Oh, these?
if we were to wait and do this after.
Probably do a lot better, but
Then we could find out if anybody was paying attention.
yeah, I don't have that many books though. Okay, so the last question. The key Marco cat has been on loan to the Marco Island Historical Museum since December 2018. It's a small local history museum. Has anybody been there, by the way, in this audience? Yeah? You've been there a while. Yeah, a couple people, okay. Well, if you had to guess, how many people, as of this month, have seen the key Marco cat since it's been on exhibit there since December 2018? So that's about 7 years.
How many days a week is the museum open?
That's a good question. It's open Tuesday through Saturdays, so that's what, 5 days a week? 9 to 4.
We would have to put in a seconds.
How many seconds? No, we'll go easy on this one. And this is an approximate number, I should say. Okay.
Just do a decimal?
No, you can do round up to a whole number for this. All right. All right, that's all the questions. We're gonna slowly answer them throughout the presentation. In the meantime, Will's gonna pass around the basket and put your answers in there, and he's got the answer key. So he's gonna figure out the winners, and hopefully we'll have that at the end of the presentation so we can give these books away. Sorry, Will.
Oh, no, please.
All right, as you're doing that, I'll go ahead and
Folks, you just pass them to the front of the room.
pass them on down to the end of the road.
Yeah, why not? Not too crazy. It's spring break, I'm using myself right now.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Got a couple up here. All right, thanks everybody. I'm looking forward to seeing the answers, and I appreciate you embracing the chaos of this moment. So back to Marco Island Historical Museum. As I said, that's where I was 10 years prior to coming up here to Tallahassee. Some pictures of the museum there. It's a wonderful little museum. It actually first opened in 2010, so one of my jobs when I first got there was to help flesh out and develop its permanent exhibits, which were previously, empty galleries basically, and so it was a real challenge, but it was really rewarding, and they've come a long way in putting together their outstanding exhibits and programs that they're continuing today. So the key mark of cat, as you can see, is well. Here's a clue to your first question. It's about 6 inches in height, so it's not very big. There is a big, I don't know if it's in this picture now. There's a huge statue of it outside the museum. It's a 6 foot tall bronze. A lot of people think that is the key mark of cat when it comes to the museum, and we have to direct them inside. But as you can see, it's the image on the right is actually a picture of it in the field in 1896 when it was first pulled from the muck, and this is it. It's kind of glamour shot from the Smithsonian. It lives at the Smithsonian Institution permanently, and it's generally thought to be anthropomorphic, which means it has both human and animal-like characteristics. And so an artist named Merrill Clark, who did a lot of the work in Gainesville at the Natural History Museum there, if you've ever been, put this illustration together to kind of illustrate the difference between Florida panther, the key marker of cat, which is sort of in a transition state between human and feline, and show the differences there in the pose of all three. As I said, the Marco Island is home to the original Key Marco archaeological site. If you don't know where Marco Island is, it's basically straight across Tamiami Trail from Miami, and just south of Naples in Collier County. It's right on the coast in sort of the northwest part of the 10,000 islands. And so this area up here in Marco Island is known as Old Marco. It used to actually be an entirely separate key from the main island, and you can see there was a sort of a marsh here that separated it, but development, especially in the 20s and 30s, connected this to the mainland Marco Island, but all of that, this area here, was an archaeological site. This is all shell mounds and ridges, and within this larger site, there was this little muck pit right here, which is blown up here, that was home to what turned out to be more than 1,000 incredibly well-preserved, ordinarily perishable artifacts made of wood and plant fiber and bone and other materials that just don't normally survive, especially in Southwest Florida archaeological context. and they were perfectly well preserved. Some of them had paint pigment still visible on them, and in fact, actually, some of them still have paint pigment visible on them, but many have since deteriorated because they're made of wood, just sitting in museum collections because they were excavated so long ago at a time when people didn't have the technology to really preserve it, the way we would now. So it's a remarkably important archaeological site. It's here on the north end of what is now Marco Island. You can go down here. Here's the museum. It's in the center of the island. But if you come down and go up here into Old Marco, there's an old hotel there. It's in pretty rough shape, the Old Marco Inn, but it's actually you can see it. It's where they dried out some of the artifacts on the steps, and you can see that in some of the photographs. So it's a really cool spot if you ever get the chance to go down and see Old Marco. A little tiny bit of old Florida that's left, and otherwise largely developed island. And so this was the book that I worked on, and it's basically the outline of the book is the outline of this talk. Some might say this is clever, probably more would say it's cringe as a kid. But in researching this, there really are, different periods of time that I found interesting in the evolution of the life of the object and the meaning that it took on in those different periods really changed, especially from when it was originally created to where it is now. And so it was a really interesting study in material culture, and kind of shines a light on all of those different contexts in which it was a part of. And so I'll try to go through them as quickly as I can. The first chapter, of course, is starting at the very beginning. In the museum world, we talk about provenance, the history, the life history of an object when we're considering something for the collection. And provenience is an archaeological world, where something is found within an archaeological site. But the real true beginning for this particular object, of course, would have been somewhere in nature, as part of probably a native plant or tree. But we don't know what kind, and that's kind of strange to think about because of how well known the artifact is. And so, sorry, I went one too far. So before we asked for this object on loan from the Smithsonian, of course, we were trying to do the best we could with the most up-to-date research and interpretation in the exhibit. And one of the main questions we got at the museum was, well, what kind of wood is it made from? And a lot of times you see it identified as buttonwood, but we didn't know that with any certainty. And it turns out neither did the Smithsonian. They actually sent their team of botanists to check out the object before it came down on loan. And of course, basically, you can't determine it without cutting out a chunk of it and examining it on a cellular level under a microscope. So in the book, we've outlined maybe which ones were more likely than others. There are studies that have been done on other key Marco artifacts that are, less important than the cat, where they were cut and identified. And of course, the most prevalent types at the Key Marco site are generally cypress and pine, but you do have all these other different species represented. And at the Pineland site, which is about 30 miles north of Marco Island, an incredibly important Calusa site as well, they've done a lot of archaeobotanical studies on the types of plant species represented in material culture there. So you've got some suspects here. It's very likely on this list, but of course we don't know for sure, and we probably never will, because they're not going to probably cut a piece out of the Key Marco cat for good reason. And so who made the Key Marco cat? And so usually the cat and the other Key Marco artifacts are attributed generally to the Calusa people of Southwest Florida. And that is probably correct, but probably a little more complicated than that. And again, not being an archaeologist, but understanding that the archaeological areas or regions in this part of Florida identify, you've got the Caloosahatchee area, and this is not a fixed line here, this is sort of a rough estimate, but generally it is based on pottery types that you see at different archaeological sites. And so down here, you see Marco Island as part of this larger glades area, which goes really all the way up, maybe a little past Naples, and then up here you've got the Caloosahatchee area, and Mound Key was the Calusa capital, at least at the time of European arrival. And here's the Pineland site I was talking about, another important and well-preserved part of the University of Florida site. Now is maintained by the University of Florida. They do a lot of research there. But down here up until about 1350, a lot of the pottery actually looks quite different than the pottery types that you see up here. Different designs, and so that indicates there might be a little bit of a different culture going on down here than say further north. After that time, the pottery starts to look more similar across all of South Florida. The archaeologists believe maybe at that time that's when the Calusa domain really started to expand and they exerted their influence across the southern part of the peninsula. And all that is just to say that we don't know exactly how old the Key Marco artifacts are. So depending on when they were made, they may be more attributable to, say, the Glades area people than, quote unquote, Calusa that we know more about from Spanish contact time. And so, where was the Key Marco cat made? Well, it wasn't necessarily made at Key Marco, of course, but in looking at old maps and ethnohistoric records from the time of European contact, there's several mentions of a place called Muspa, and that's, this map is not accurate, but obviously, but Muspa is generally located down here, and you've got this little piece of land sticking out, but it's more than just that. We actually have written accounts by some Spanish people that were down there at the time listing different names of Calusa towns going down the southwest Florida coast, and we've even got a geographic description with very rough details about latitude and longitude, but also describing certain geographic features that almost certainly are the Marco Island area. The one unique feature on Marco Island is a series of sand dunes that are more than 50 feet high still in elevation. They're naturally formed, but that's like a mountain in southwest Florida. And so this person, Juan Lopez de Velasco, in the 1500s identified those features as a place where Musco was located. So generally, it may not have been a specific Key Marco site as imagined here by Merrill Clark, but generally the area around Marco Island is thought to be, or once was known as Muspa to the Calusa, at least as interpreted by the Spanish, if that can get more complicated. So all that is to say maybe it should be known as the Muspa, Key Muspa cat. And most of this is just to point out how much we think we know, but how much we don't actually know with any certainty about a lot of these objects. So, so chapter 2, this chapter really just talks about the process of bringing something like this to life at the time. Certainly would not have been a small feat. May have involved multiple people. You've got to think about the motivations for creating it and sort of the tools that they had at their disposal. The Calusa were well known for their prolific shell tool manufacturing. They had more than 50 shell tool types, at least as identified by archaeologists. And so a number of different steps might have gone into collecting the wood and initially shaping it, probably using fire and shell tools to shape the larger piece of wood, if there was one, and then into something smaller to then work with finer detail tools. And so here's just a basic look. You got all sides of the cat. You don't often see the back of the cat and that beautiful sweeping tail all the way up the back. As I said, it's about 6 inches in height. And the answer to your first question, if I didn't answer already, it's 6.97 ounces. So it's very, very light. It's about, if you're holding like a half-empty soda can, that's about how much it weighs. And so, in looking at just the object itself, you got to think about, well, why did they, size it that way? Was it that have an influence on its purpose? Was it used as sort of a handheld thing or a piece of furniture? And just thinking about, the details too that they put into this thing. And how remarkable they are. And generally, the tool that is most associated with the Key Marco cat, especially because you can, if you look really closely at it, you may not be able to see here, but there are some striations in the wood that kind of indicate use of shark tooth tools. And so shark tooth tools were actually found at the site as well. And you can see in this field photo here from 1896, these are all, except for these are atlatls, these are all handles for shark tooth tools. And the little shark's teeth with the hole drilled in them would have been hafted onto the ends of these and likely used as carving instruments for these very fine designs and details that you see, especially, you know, in the face there. It's beautifully carved and symmetrical. Just a wonderful work of art. And as I said, it's generally considered to be anthropomorphic. And thinking about the preparation process for the object as well, the archaeologist, who I'll talk a little bit about later on, who discovered this object, his name was Frank Hamilton Cushing. And he was quite the eccentric but brilliant guy. He was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. But he speculated, you know, when they found this object, that it was actually, he noticed how remarkable the preservation and the condition of it was, even compared to the other objects at the time. So he speculated that it was coated with some sort of varnish or possibly animal fat from slain victims, even, was one of his kind of theories, which was, you know, and it is sort of a darker coloration when you compare it to a lot of the other animal carvings, some of which we know were carved from either cypress or pine. But one thing that was really interesting in researching this was that if you go back, and John, our registrar, is again with the laser, he knows about condition reports at museums. And so they had all sorts of condition reports going way back to the early days of this becoming a museum object, which noticed there were several crevices that are filled with this kind of yellowed preservative residue. And so that led me on sort of a chase through the archives, and it turned out that Frank Cushing, the archaeologist, sort of did undocumented preservative treatments on a lot of the objects, and he was basically making it up as he went. And he practiced on some of the, you know, quote unquote lesser objects until he perfected this glycerin bath that he then dipped the Key Marco cat in. So now it is super well preserved compared to all the other objects. But he never really wrote down explicitly that he did that or put it in any of the museum records, and then he died very prematurely. So, so yeah, it was just sort of a surprising thing to learn about the cat, but makes us feel a little better about having it on exhibit as long as we have. So anyway, that was just a thing we learned in researching the cat. And so chapter 3 of the book is really about you know, why was the Key Marco cat? Why was it made? What did it mean to the people that made it? You know, and there are different theories out there put out by anthropologists, archaeologists, and they range from the mundane, you know, like a piece of furniture or, you know, a toy, to the mystical, you know, maybe a transformational being in a state of transformation between human and panther. As part of perhaps a religious ritual. And so it's probably the most important thing to know about the object, and also probably is the most difficult thing to know about the object, because the Calusa, of course, didn't keep written records, and the only written records we have from that time period are from the Spanish, which have a certain biased point of view. But, you know, one thing, yeah, sorry about the cat puns, I just couldn't help myself, but one of the things that we just kind of assume about the Key Marco cat is in its name, and that is that it's a cat at all, which to me I never really questioned until people started coming up to me and saying, that's not a cat, you know. And, the most common alternative people think is a squirrel. Yes, I heard someone say squirrel. Yeah, and so so we you know, base the identification of it as a cat, or most likely the now endangered Florida panther, just because they were known to live in that part of the state at the same time. It has also been attributed as possibly a bobcat, but if you look at that, you know, beautiful sweeping tail at the back, that sort of rules that out, if you ask me. But again, it is sort of in a state of sort of half human, half feline, because you see the way the cat is sitting here versus the way the carving is posed, and this would be sort of impossible for a cat unless you're kind of looking at it abstractly as compared to a human. And so some people have interpreted this to represent sort of a masked performer, or in some sort of transition between human and animal. So, and I think Bob mentioned earlier, you know, the ancient Egyptians, of course, worshiped cats. Cat worship goes all the way back. There's cat painting representations in caves 30,000 years ago, all the way up to the memes that we see on the internet today. You know, people love and worship cats in different ways. I have two of my own, and so it's really no surprise then that Cushion, you know, when he first uncovered this artifact, immediately compared it to the finest art and artifacts of the ancient Egyptians and Assyrians, and so you've just got a couple other examples, and there's some more in the book, but this is a particularly famous one at the British Museum. It's about 2,500 years old, from ancient Egypt. And then there's the question of, you know, how was it used? What was it used for? And so basically in trying to figure this out, anthropologists can look to a couple different sources. One is the ethno-historic record, which are the records that were made at the time of the Calusa by the Spanish. And so the most frequently cited ethno-historic account in regard to the Key Marco artifacts in particular comes from Father Juan Regal in 1567. He had set up a mission on that Calusa capital in Mound Key. And at that time, he described a masked procession going up to their place on the top of the mound, which was, you know, the men were wearing masks and they were holding what Regal called idols, wooden idols that may have been these animal, or not these exact, but similar to these animal figures, like the Key Marco cat, which may have had matching wooden face masks, and the women were singing it. It was a big ceremony and ritual of religious importance, and so that is very often attributed, you know, as the primary interpretation of how they might have been used. But you can also look to the ethnographic record, and so for anthropologists, that's looking at living or modern cultures for comparisons. Of course, looking to other Native American societies. In North America, you know, the panther in particular is associated with stories of the hunt and warfare. It's a very important animal in a lot of Native American religions. And so there may be some elements of that as well as to why it was used or how it was used by the Calusa and their ancestors. Okay, and so this chapter, Moment of Truth, really talks about there was some key moment in the life of this object that led to it being deposited into this muck pit on Marco Island. And we don't know exactly what happened, or when it happened, or why it happened. But there are some different theories as to what may have deposited it and the many hundreds of other objects that you just don't usually see survive in archaeological sites into this muck pit. And so the leading theory, I think, is a possible storm or storm surge. You know, we get a lot of hurricanes in Southwest Florida, and devastating storm surge along with them. That site was right out in the Marco River, which has seen dramatic storm surge from recent hurricanes in that same area. And so it would, you know, make some sense for these many hundreds of, you know, very special objects, not just everyday utilitarian stuff, you know, that you ordinarily see, but the whole gamut of material culture deposited probably contemporaneously all at one time into this muck pit. And there's evidence that the structures that they may have even been in fell in on top of them as well, because there were large wooden posts going across where the top of the artifacts were, and thatched roof, which some of which actually survived, the palmetto thatch survived. But there are some little bits of evidence that might contest that as well. For example, there was a wooden canoe paddle that was sort of found at an angle, and then it was burned off at the top, and so there's some artifacts where actually showed evidence of charring or burning, which wouldn't make sense if everything were just swept in by a storm. You know, maybe they came back and cleaned up the site, or maybe there was something else going on there entirely. So there are different theories as to what exactly happened, but it was obviously a sad and important day in the life of these objects that led to them being deposited into the muck. As I said, we don't know when exactly it happened, which leaves us a lot of questions, as I said earlier, about who exactly made this. Was it the Glades culture? Was it the later, quote unquote, Calusa? And part of the reason for that is it was excavated in 1896. So, radiocarbon dating didn't exist at that time. Archaeological techniques were just still in their infancy. Cushing actually made a grid system, but it was pretty much the first of its kind for an archaeological dig. And so most of the context from where these things were excavated was lost, as soon as they were excavated. And so generally the range that we've ascribed to the key marker artifacts, at least down at the Marco Museum, was anywhere between about 500 and 1500. And we stopped at 1500 because there were no European goods found at the site. And so that lack of evidence of the material culture from the Spanish indicates that it was sometime prior to 1500. But the pottery types that you find there, as well as radiocarbon dates that were taken later on, after radiocarbon dates were invented, tell us that it could have been as early as 500. But there's controversy over those because they sat in museum storage for so long before they were radiocarbon dated that they were, back in the day, they used to treat a lot of artifacts with pesticides. And so one archaeologist in particular thinks that the radiocarbon dates were erroneous because they were contaminated with pesticides. But of course, you've got this collection has been split up into multiple museums over the past century. So some collections have been treated differently than others. And so we actually did radiocarbon dates on these bowls in the Marco Island Historical Society collection, which are not from the muck pit, but from an adjacent part of the same site. And they generally actually matched up to the same time frame, about 600 to 900, as many of the other early radiocarbon dates that were done in the 70s. And then the Penn Museum did a few radiocarbon dates about 2 years ago that were came into about 1200 to 1300. So, and those were out in the actual key Marco artifacts themselves, and those were much different than the dates done on other key Marco artifacts at the Smithsonian. So, there's a big time range there, and that's the reason why there's a lot of controversy. But technology is continuing to evolve, and I thought it was really cool what they did at the Penn Museum, which I'll talk about too as well. 400 years of solitude. This is the muck pit. You get a better look at it. This is prior to excavation. All those wonderful, amazing artifacts are right here under this foul-smelling swamp in Southwest Florida. It was a horrible working environment, and they had to bail out the site, the water constantly. It was, sandflies, mosquitoes. It smelled like rotten eggs. But all the while, there's a lot going on above the surface in this area, while the cat and these other artifacts were sitting underneath the surface. The Calusa, of course, ultimately succumbed to the European, invasion, essentially, of the peninsula. They were forced out of the state, and by 1760, the last native people in Florida, including the Calusa, fled to Cuba, and so there was a rapid depopulation of that part of the state. And then, of course, about 100 years later, pioneer settlers coming in from further north started to populate the area, including Marco, and there was a family, the Collier family, that settled on the island in about 1870. This is one of their properties. You can see these are all shell mounds surrounding one of their early structures. This photo was taken in the 1890s. And they had remarkably productive vegetable crops, largely due to the organic, super rich soils under these shell mounds, and they would take those vegetables and down to Key West and sell them at the market there. But that development of the area ultimately led to the discovery of these things because Collier one day was out basically collecting muck as fertilizer for his vegetable gardens, and started to just uncover these artifacts that he recognized immediately must have been something made by human hands. And so that's what ultimately led to their discovery. And of course, below the surface, there wasn't much going on, but there was a lot in terms of science that was keeping these particular artifacts alive, including what was an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment. And so that hydrogen sulfide smell that Cushing and his crew encountered as they were digging through the muck was because of that oxygen-free environment inhibits the growth of bacteria that would have caused these items to decay otherwise in weeks or months. And there was a remarkable level of alkalinity in the soil provided by all of this shell. These are shell benches that were under and around the muck pit, so that helped preserve even the bone artifacts in almost pristine condition. So it was a really unique combination of factors that helped preserve these things, and archaeologists ever since this excavation have been really trying to duplicate it with not much success across Florida. And so chapter 6, this really talks about the archaeological excavation, when these things were found, and the unprecedented circumstances that the archaeologist and his crew were dealing with. There were 70 days between when this particular object was found and when it made it back to the museum. And you gotta think 1896, they're pulling out things that were turning to mush basically almost immediately upon contact with the air around them. And they had no idea what to do to help preserve them. They did all the best that they could, drying things out, and taking pictures of them and creating artwork. But it was a very, hazardous time if you're the object. Thinking about those 70 days, because you're in the hands of people that had never done this before. And so it ended up traveling 900 miles from where it was excavated up to the Smithsonian Institution. And so those were probably some of the most perilous days in its very long life. This is Frank Hamilton Cushing. There's a portrait of him on the left there. As I said, he was a brilliant sort of eccentric anthropologist. He was one of the first practitioners of what's called participant observation. He went and lived with the Zuni people of the American Southwest and learned about their culture by living with and being a part of their culture. He wasn't really an archaeologist so much until he took part in this expedition, and the reason he did so was basically a matter of really fortuitous coincidences. He was very sickly, and he was seeing his personal physician at the University of Pennsylvania, and somebody came up from Marco, a British lieutenant colonel, brought these things to his friend at the Penn Museum to have him check them out. And that friend wasn't there, but Cushing was there seeing his doctor, and he jumped on the opportunity to go check out the Key Marco site, and ended up, of course, being famous for discovering these things. And so it's really just a matter of coincidences that led him down to Marco Island. And again, here's just some more pictures from the site itself. You can see the trough they were using to bail out seawater, from the site. There's objects here in situ. There's a mortar and pestle made of wood, and they're just pulling these things out of the ground constantly, trying to prevent them from decaying on the site. These are some shell tools with the wooden handles still attached to them. And these are not ceramics, these are actually wooden bowls, which you just don't ever see in an archaeological site, just by the dozen. And of course, they found weapons, atlatls, shark-toothed sabers, slashing weapons, and of course all the animal figureheads, some with paints on them, wooden masks. I mean, it's just a remarkable assemblage of artifacts. And Cushing, you know, after seeing about or hearing about this site, took a quick trip down to Marco Island in 1895 to check it out. Said, "Yep, this is important. I need to come back here." Got a full-scale expedition set up, and one of the smartest things he did was hire an artist to come with him on the expedition, and that was this man, Wells Sawyer, who has had a very long, successful career as an artist, doing a lot of landscape oil paintings. He ended up living in Sarasota until about 1960. He was almost 100 years old when he passed, and not only was he a great photographer, he took hundreds of pictures of the objects as they were coming out of the ground, many of which didn't even make it off the site. You know, they fell apart before they were even packed up. But he also painted these beautiful watercolors of some of the most important artifacts that actually still had, you know, paint pigments visible on them. Because if you look at these objects today, the paint is barely visible, if at all. And so he was able to capture what some of these objects looked like when they were first pulled from the ground. Otherwise, that would be just lost to history. And so, you know, the expedition itself, the cat was found on March 5th, but this expedition actually started towards the end of 1895. So several months earlier, they hit a lot of snags. The boat they were supposed to take down to Marco was away on a sponging expedition. They spent all their money on excavating other sites further north before they even got to Marco. So he's writing letters back to the Penn Museum and the Smithsonian asking for more funding. Very stressed out. They weren't really happy with what they were finding. You know, Cushing wasn't exactly like a super peppy guy, at least from reading his journals, as I could tell. They were suffering, you know, a lot of depression and anxiety. Wells Sawyer, the artist, was writing back home saying, "The work I'm doing is just the worst I've ever done. I don't think this is important." And then you see a change right around March 4th, March 5th, when they found this and many other artifacts, where all of a sudden they totally changed their tune, and this is the best work I've ever done, and this is amazing what we're finding. Cushing actually used the word happy, which was very rare, I think, for him. And you can see they're just sort of fawning descriptions of the cat in particular, but these other important artifacts, the masks and animal figureheads, really turned the tide on the expedition, got them more funding, and it enabled them to completely excavate the site. And actually, the General Wesley Powell came down from the Smithsonian to inspect the site himself, who was a big deal in anthropology back then as well. So, as I mentioned, then they had to be shipped 900 miles in 1896 from Marco Island, which was very remote. And so, of course, that would have been done. They packed it up in crates. I think they used sawdust as a packing material for a lot of it. This is the hull of the ship, the schooner known as the Silver Spray. This was painted by Wells Sawyer. And they took that vessel up the coast to Tarpon Springs, but it actually, while it was there at anchor, got swept out to sea. So then they had to do a dramatic rescue of the boat with all of its contents. And then most of the artifacts were then sent by rail up to the University of Pennsylvania, because there was this joint division of artifacts. Penn Museum funded it, but Cushing was a Smithsonian employee. So they agreed to divvy up the artifacts. So most of them were going up to Philadelphia, but he didn't trust the rail system, so he actually personally packed the cat and several other artifacts in a box that he then took with him via horseback and then train up to Washington, D.C. So even right at that point, the artifacts were separated from each other. And so, everything arrived either in Philadelphia or Washington, 1896, which brings us to another real time of uncertainty in the life of these objects. It took them 12 years after being discovered to be accessioned into the collections in 1908. Doesn't make us look so bad. The museum does the job. Takes us a little while too sometimes, you know. 12 years is a long time, and some of the reasons for that were, Cushing from the beginning, as I said, was generally in poor health. He also had financial troubles. He was accused of fraud, even on some of the key Marco artifacts, and so he spent a lot of time after getting back trying to clear his name, which he eventually did. And then he died, unfortunately, just a few years later in April 1900. He was only 42 years old. And so at that time, he had been working on a manuscript, and trying to divvy up fairly the collection between the Penn Museum and the Smithsonian, but just hadn't quite finished it up. And there you can see actually his original packing slip for the box that held the key Marco cat as he took it up to the Smithsonian with him. And there is the cat on the original field inventory for the key Marco site. So, this left a lot of uncertainty, and actually, if you go back and look at the original inventories that he created, the key Marco cat is actually designated to go to the Penn Museum. And of course, now it's at the Smithsonian Museum. So how did that happen? Well, after his death in 1900, other people that weren't even involved at all with the expedition had to come to some sort of agreement and resolution. And so they went back and forth, the people at the two different institutions, coming up with what they thought was a fair division of artifacts. But of course, all the artifacts were completely unique and unprecedented. And so how do you divide something like that up, a collection like that up? And so they finally came close to an agreement here in April 1901, about a year after Cushing died. But in sending the final list back to the Penn Museum, that was otherwise typewritten, somebody wrote here in pen that they wanted to just add this one, see if they could sneak it in. And of course they noticed that at the Penn Museum. And so then there was this whole back and forth about the key Marco cat. And basically it was the secretary at the Smithsonian Institution at the time really thought that the Penn Museum was getting all the choicest, as he put it, animal carvings, and thought they should at least have one at the Smithsonian, and that was the one that the secretary liked the best. And so he asked as, quote, a personal favor if you could just see to keep this on the list, and the Penn Museum curator acquiesced, and so the key Marco cat stayed at the Smithsonian Institution. Everything else went back to the Penn Museum, and so that's how that happened. And so began the life of the cat as a museum object, as a museum exhibit person and nerd myself. This was my favorite chapter to research, and I'll tell you the reason for that is, one of the reasons was a lot of the people on Marco Island were very excited to get the key Marco cat back on display. They thought it belonged on Marco Island. It's been locked away in a drawer for 100 years in the Smithsonian. Why don't they ever show it? Nobody can ever see it or appreciate it. And I didn't have a really good answer as to why, other than, of course, it's being preserved. It's very important. It's of national, international importance. But I didn't know about its exhibition history. And it turns out that the key Marco cat has actually been on display for 73 years and 5 months of the nearly 130 that it's been out of the ground, which is a shockingly long amount of time to be on display for an object that fragile. And so researching the exhibit history, you can see this is the earliest known exhibit photo I could find. And this is in the National Museum, which became the National Museum of Natural History. You can see the silhouette of the cat there, and these are the paintings, well-Sawyer paintings of the key Marco masks. And you can see the presentation style is sort of the old cabinets of curiosity. There's not a lot of interpretation going on here, but the records indicate that these objects were basically on display here since about 1913. Until almost 1962. So that's a very long time, especially with these huge windows letting in lots of natural sunlight. Now there may have been changes in and out there, that they're very poor documentation from that time period, but generally it was thought to be on display for most of that time in this hall. This is now actually area of the cafe if you go to the National Museum of Natural History. But in the 60s, they totally redid that space, but they didn't give the cat a break. They put it on display for another 22 years, and we know those dates for sure. And one of the cool things about seeing it in these different exhibits over time, you really get to see how the interpretation evolves. You know, when it was found, anthropology was still really in its infancy. And of course, museum interpretation has evolved over that time as well. And so here you go from that cabinet of curiosities to at least some contextual information. They talk about the Calusa, you know, and some other more utilitarian artifacts. These are actually wooden float pegs that would have been used to hold netting up. There was actually netting uncovered at the site as well. You can still see the original knots. If you go over to the museum in Gainesville, they have some of that on display there. So yeah, 22 years here at the Smithsonian again. And then what happened in about 1984 was they built this huge storage facility in Suitland, Maryland. So they took a lot of this stuff off display and put it in that new collection storage. But once the cat was in there, it was immediately requested for a traveling exhibit, and it ended up traveling, I believe, to 7 different exhibits at 11 different venues since 1985. And so it took part in this exhibit, which saw it go to the National Gallery of Art, go to Detroit, Houston, part of an art historical perspective on Native American artifacts. It then took place in probably one of the most ambitious exhibits ever put on in the history of this country. It's called Circa 1492 at the National Gallery of Art. They had loans of work from this time period from all over the world, from Queen Elizabeth's collection. They had Renaissance artists, and then they had, you know, everything you could think of. And then here representing all of North America, you've got some of the key Marco artifacts. These are 3 of the artifacts that are at the Penn Museum now. There's a deer figurehead, what's called a wolf figurehead, some sort of canine, and a pelican figurehead, and the cat, of course, and there it is in the picture. But this exhibit was a huge deal at the time. Of course, it was commemorating Columbus's 500 year anniversary of arriving in the Americas. And you know, it was protested by a lot of Native American groups at the time. And more than 500,000 people saw this. It was only on display for 3 months. Huge exhibition. That was followed by a very quaint exhibition in Collier County. The first time it went back to Florida for about 6 months at the Collier County Museum, celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Key Marco expedition. It had more of a local feel to it. You can see it there. And then, and even, this is probably the strangest exhibit it's been part of, if I can say that. The Key Marco Cat Millennium Exhibition. Everybody remember Y2K and crazy. This during Y2K was sitting in a bank on Marco Island in a repurposed Beanie Baby case. Beanie Babies were big at the time. And it was wheeled away into the bank vault at night as a security measure. And so this was done by the Marco Island Historical Society just shortly after they formed. And that's who I ultimately ended up working for some years later. But what this did was really sort of get the ball rolling on a movement on the island locally to build a museum, because that's why they're having it in the bank. You know, they didn't have a museum to put it in. And so that helped them raise a lot of money and gain momentum towards ultimately building what became the Marco Island Historical Museum. The conservators at the Smithsonian said they probably wouldn't do that again, but it was really important, at least for the local community. And again, you can see it really started traveling around the country. Make sure I'm not running over time here. I went to Chicago, St. Louis, National Museum again. And this exhibit was interesting in that it actually first introduced Native American perspectives and involved collaboration not just with museum curators but Native communities as well. And then you actually, in this exhibit where I went to the Peabody Essex Museum, actually get the full Native American perspective on what this object means. They attribute it to a Southeastern artist for the first time. They also acknowledge more about what they don't know about the object for the first time. So really just a sort of a window into the evolving practices in museums and anthropology, just as a representative example. And then this is our exhibit in Marco Island, where we really emphasize the local connection and tried to make a lot of different ways to engage with the cat, and especially for younger audiences. And so, we have a craft corner here where kids can put their artwork on display and interactive activities, and a little block of wood where you can pick it up and feel that 6.97 ounces in your hand as you look at the real thing. And so it's on exhibit there since December. It started, the exhibit officially opened in January, but we'll be there until next April. So about one more year. If you get the chance to go down to Southwest Florida, go to Fort Myers or Naples, stop into Marco Island and check out the cat, because it's probably going to be taking a cat nap for a while after it gets back. But it is obviously in high demand, and so who knows? I'm excited to see where it ends up next and how it's interpreted next. And so this is the last chapter we're almost through, but really, this chapter talks about sort of the transformation into this sort of cultural symbol and icon of Florida's Native American history and culture. And you can see it was actually put on a postage stamp in 1989 here, and it's received a lot of special treatment over the years, even amongst the other 1,000+ key Marco artifacts. It's stored separately in actually where the offices are for the Smithsonian curators, in a special plush little box, which my real cat would absolutely love. Very, very well cared for, and it has been by many people over many centuries. And so, as I said, the Marco Island Historical Museum was eventually built. They built the buildings to sort of resemble these pile-dwelling structures that Cushing imagined. This is fire-rated PVC thatched roof, but designed to sort of resemble a shell mound and midden. And here's the bronze 6-foot-tall cat sculpture, which is sort of a local photo spot. A couple of interns there posing next to it. And they built this building before I started looking there. Right under here in the center of the building is what they called the vault. It was the architectural feature that was a must-have. So from the very beginning, that thing was to house the key Marco cat. That's how serious they were about getting it on loan. They, I think at the time, had hoped maybe permanently, but that's probably not going to happen. But we still had to make a huge investment in the museum to just prepare for having it temporarily. And so, we got it in 2018, but what happened in 2017, we had a direct hit landfall from Hurricane Irma, which you probably remember. It was a major hurricane at the time. And so that was a great test for our museum. And we ended up getting this generator. This is a huge generator that we lowered in place and powers the building now in the event of a power loss. We lost power for about a week after Irma. And again, Ian in 2022 came through, and the cat did great, the building did great. But it's on a barrier island. That water, the storm surge, is always a threat. And of course, there's great concern over the environmental conditions when you have an object of that fragility, made of wood in that age. And so we have to make sure that there's a controlled microclimate in each of the cases, humidity, light levels, temperature, watch for pests. And so this is the Penn Museum registrar working on doing a condition report, installing one of the objects, the alligator figurehead there. But we also had to completely redo the exhibit, build it around these loan objects and make sure the interpretation was on par with the expectations of the lending institutions. And so all that is to say, we put in about $1 million of money into the museum between the county system and the historical society to prepare for this 6-inch tall object. But the good thing about that is now the museum, you know, as I said, it was built in 2010, and so now, you know, 15 years later, it's very well prepared, not only to house the cat, which will go back next year, but also, you know, it has a collection of its own of 50,000 objects that are now more well cared for. They have plans in place in the event of emergencies, and so overall, and it allows them now to get loans in the future from other institutions without having to go through all this. So they're very well set up for the future, and a lot of that is just due to the cat and all the work that went into making it available for display. And here's just some of the impacts that the cat had. You know, economic impact, a study estimated, you know, more than $6 million output in Collier County per year over 5 years. You've got our visitation. We had more in our first 4 months than we had ever had in a single year when the cat first got there. Of course, COVID happened in 2020, so that slowed things down a little bit, but overall, to this point, the estimate is about 138,000 people that have come to see it, so whoever guessed slightly under that, there's your winner. And generally, you know, the most important thing is that it's really raised public awareness and interest in not only, you know, Marco Island's history and culture, but Florida's as well, and Native American and Calusa people that lived there centuries before we did. And here you can see, you know, it's really sort of taken on a life of its own, especially locally. You've got the postage stamp there, it's on books, magazine covers, jewelry, some unauthorized jewelry on the island. The cat is always decked out for our different, days. There's little stuffed cats if you go to the gift shop on Marco Island. Those are very popular as well. You know, and there's, you know, I have mixed feelings about like the commodification of something that once was probably of sacred importance, you know, to the Native American people that created it. And it just shows you sort of the way that we look at it now versus the way it was really intended to be looked at by its creators. And that sort of evolution across time is, you know, sort of unusual just because of this particular object, but really interesting and sort of sad to think about, at least for me, but also it's a great way to introduce people to these subjects and engage them with it in a way that they might not otherwise do. So it's just sort of a complex thing. And so what's next? You know, as I said, it'll probably be requested by someone else for a loan. There's been a lot of great research still ongoing. I was fortunate to work with the Penn Museum quite a bit as a consulting scholar, and so we did an exhibit with some students there about the key marker collections that they have, and there's quite a bit. This is actually a mold of the cat in the Penn Museum collections that we found that had been missing for decades, and they actually ended up making bronze castings of those for certain members of the expedition, and this is one beautiful library there. So there's a lot more in those records that probably can be learned, and as I said, you know, they're still doing radiocarbon dates on some of the artifacts. There's new technologies that they can use to hopefully learn more about these things, as long as we keep them, you know, well preserved for future generations to learn from and enjoy. So this gets to how are we doing with the answers? Do we have any winners?
Yeah, we've got some semi-fairly close.
Closest on the, does it have to be all four or just the specific?
The original picture of it.
All right, this one's the closest on the first answer. Okay, so the question of how much does it weigh? With 6.12 ounces, Scott McKinley. All right. Congratulations, Scott. This copy is yours. Do what you like with it. And then, let's see. The other book that we created, this is basically the Cliff Notes version of that book. It's the same story, but with fun pictures, and it takes about 5 minutes to read. For little kids, but maybe some of you have kids or grandkids that might be interested in this, and this was something done by the Historical Society as well. And so we'll get that to the winner of the second question. Which was, oh yes, how many miles traveled?
Yeah.
The answer was 12,000.
Is anybody even close?
Looks like the closest one I have here is also Scott. Did you read this already?
But that's okay, I have a class. I have a class, so that would be. I guess 7,000.
This is kind of like, you got the third one too. How about a runner?
He used to be an archaeologist.
Thank you, Google.
Yeah, to somebody else. Come on.
Okay, for our question about how long has it been on exhibit, roughly, the answer was 73 years, 5 months. With the answer of 63 years, 5 months, we have John Marks. Okay, and then the last question was, how many people have seen the Key Marco CAD at the Marco Historical Museum since December 2018? The number I have here is 138,000 people, and the closest number I have to that is 20,000. Jeff Mitchum.
Okay, Jeff.
Are you sure it's not 150,000? I want to read it.
Judges, is there a higher number?
We went as fast as we could through there.
These are the cards I have here. You had 100,000?
There was a lot of people that had over.
Don Davis, and I was close on the miles too, I think, but,
Okay.
I mean,
Well.
it's okay.
Alright, I didn't even cause any controversy.
Yes.
Well, no.
Could do a rock, paper, scissors or something. Yeah.
I'm a retired professional archaeologist.
I thought I recognized your name. Alright.
Any questions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much.
The weight of this item seems to be empirical. Has it changed over time, or do you expect it to change over time?
That's a good question. I bet it changed when they put it in that glycerin.
No, nothing that's affected since you've weighed it in presentation form.
Yeah, no, I haven't weighed it since it's gone on display, but we can weigh it again after it comes off display. Yeah, I wouldn't imagine that it would change too
You
terribly.
would not imagine it would change.
The weight of the object?
Yes.
The comment by Wells said it's barely eight inches. And I was
Yeah.
gonna raise my hand then and say, hey, it shrink. And she said it was.
I think that was just a rough field estimate by him, without measuring it. So most of the other references to it call it about 6 inches, and it was like slightly under that when we actually measured it with calipers. Yeah.
Connie?
Did just bringing the cap down to Marco have any effect on the ordinances governing archaeological sites in the county?
I wish that it could say that it has. I was actually the chair of the preservation board there, and there were there's so much development going on in that area in particularly, and even in Old Marco. And unfortunately, that Old Marco Inn, I haven't been down there in a year, but was actually slated for possible demolition because it's in very bad condition, especially after a couple of the hurricanes had come through. But it's on a known important archaeological site. And it's very complicated between the county and the city of Marco Island. The county has the preservation board in place, but the city has jurisdiction, but they don't have much of a policy in place. And we tried to establish an interlocal agreement between those two entities without any real success. So it is something I do worry about because they're not just archaeological sites on the north end of the island. There's others down on the south end in the Caxambas area, and then out in the Goodland community, that entire area is also a large, largely just developed but important archaeological site as well.
For these muck ponds though, are they requiring any testing before they're filled in?
They are supposed to do that, yes. Yes. I can't say that always happens, unfortunately, but.
Were there any subsequent excavations of the site, specifically the muck pit, and is it developed now?
Yeah, there was an archaeologist actually followed in Cushing's footsteps fairly quickly. I think C.B. Moore and others came down to kind of see what else they could find. They pretty much excavated the entirety of the muck pit. At that point, they didn't find much else, but did do a lot of excavating, probably like mostly surface collecting in Marco and Goodland and Caxambas. And then there have been subsequent, in recent years, as the law now requires, through cultural resource management firms investigating when they put in like a sewer line or a swimming pool in that known area of archaeological probability, they're required to do a survey. And so that's where some of the artifacts that are now at the Marco Island Historical Museum have come in. They're excavated by professional archaeologists, documented in a report sent to the state, and then at the discretion of the landowner, sometimes those artifacts can make it into a museum collection. So there have been some of those reconstructed vessels, basically wholly, well, not intact, but now intact after being reconstructed by a person at the University of Florida, are now on display. And actually the residue in them was radiocarbon dated as well. So there is, some intact strata under the surface there, but a lot of the mounds that were once there, all of that has been completely bulldozed early in the 1900s, as they developed without those protections in place to keep them from doing that.
If you have questions, come on down. And
I was just gonna say real quickly that
Yes,
I
sir.
was able to explore the tip of East of Mujeres, which is named the Island of Women, because when you talk about how the origin of the muck pit, they discovered a completely covered by a hurricane, a pyramid. And inside the pyramid, perfectly preserved, were all little niches, and each one had an individual female in clothing with fiber. Everything was perfectly intact. Wow. Perfectly intact.
Wow.
They came running in, it's right off of Cancun. They started taking pictures, and within a year, another hurricane came and wiped it off the face.
Wow.
But in terms of the cat being, it might also have been in a situation where it was in the.
Yes, yeah, that's been one of the things that is referenced more in the book, but yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, cool.
thank you, everyone. Come on down for that question.